Hey, welcome to Regarding Men. I'm here with two of my favorite men's advocates, Paul Elam and Janice Fiamengo. Two people that I respect and admire greatly. And tonight, we're going to talk about the riots in the U.S. and Mr. Floyd. Is that his name?
Yeah.
George Floyd.
George Floyd and all the kinds of things that have to do with that. Because, man, there are a lot of different angles to all of this. I mean, there's a lot of things the media is not telling us. One of which is George Floyd was pretty much a criminal. He went to jail 5 times and spent from 2009 to 2014 in jail. When he was arrested, he apparently was high on fentanyl and on methamphetamine. And the guy, there's this video out by Candace. What is Candace's last name? I forget her last name. Yeah, Candace
Yeah,
Owen.
Candace Owen.
And it's all about how she does not defend George Floyd and why. And it's a very fascinating take on things, but that's just one of the takes we'll be talking about. But what she's saying is that she's scratching her head and saying, why is it that black people always want justice and support for criminals? She says no other race does that. White people don't ask for justice and support for criminals. Jews don't do that. She says, why do black people do that? It's a fascinating little piece and what's something we can talk a little bit about. But, there's so much more to this whole thing than meets the eye, including these two. Chauvin, who was the apparent policeman who had his knee on Floyd, and Floyd, both of these guys worked in the same place. They worked at this club as security. So the chances are they may have known each other. Also, this club has a really sketchy history, and it looks like it may have been involved in all kinds of sketchy stuff, including money laundering and things like that. And it turns out, of course, that Floyd was arrested for counterfeiting, or he passed counterfeit bills. So some people are wondering whether that may have been involved in things. And the other piece is that Minneapolis, apparently, I've heard now, is the capital in the country for FBI investigations. That there's more FBI surveillance going on there than any place in the country because of all the Somalis. So, man, just all this stuff. But then the question is for us, what does this have to do with men? What does it have to do with holding men in high regard? What do you guys think?
Janice, you want to go first?
I'll go first. I'll say a little bit anyway. There's so many angles, as you say, Tom, and in many ways, this isn't really, not really about George Floyd at all, perhaps. An entire country doesn't go into convulsions and have that spread to other countries. I mean, there have been protests and demonstrations in Canada. There have been demonstrations in the United Kingdom, apparently in Holland even. It doesn't become this almost global phenomenon just over one person. So this is about so many other things, and it doesn't seem to me that it's about what we're being told it's about either, that it's, it is about white supremacism and, a system in which whites subjugate blacks. If you actually look into the statistics, it doesn't seem that actually black men are targeted for police brutality. In fact, seems as if maybe white men are more likely to, unarmed
Yes.
white men are more likely to die in police violence. And, you're far more likely to be killed as a policeman. I think 18 times more likely to die as a policeman to be killed by a black man than vice versa. There's so many different angles to this problem. So what does this have to do with men's issues? Well, we see a lot of men out there. We see a lot of angry, despairing, hopeless men, both black and white, and presumably other colors as well. If this were simply a case of white supremacism, we wouldn't have the mayor of Seattle, I forget her name now, Jenny Durkin, is that her name? Something like that, announcing that most of the violence in the Seattle area, and she claimed in all cities across the United States, was being done by white men, which is a fascinating statement.
I'm sure she got that scientifically.
Yeah, I'm sure
Yes.
she did an in-depth study of that. I mean, and that in itself is so interesting. I mean, it might even be, not totally untrue that there are white guys involved in the violence and the looting and the burning and everything else that's going on. Very interesting that she can name them. She doesn't call them Antifa, which is probably the group that they belong to, or some Antifa affiliate. But that in itself is fascinating to me. Here are white guys who have been told, probably from the time they can remember, thinking about their position in the world, that they're wrong in every way.
Yes.
Their sex is wrong and their race is wrong. And so the idea that they would join in groups whose purpose is the violent overthrow, or the overthrow by any means necessary, of a intolerably violent and unjust system, is not particularly surprising. Many of these guys are told that that they have to make reparations in every way, every day, for who they are, because they were born male and because they were born white. Yep. So there's that whole aspect to it. Then on the other side, of course, we have the black men who are also involved in all of these protests, who have also been told from day one that there's something wrong with them. Yep. That they too need to change, that they are, they have no place in their society. They're in a situation where, we know that they endure horrific levels of violence, mostly from other black men, but still they exist in dysfunctional communities. All of the issues that we talk about as men's issues are issues that these black men face: the problems of fatherlessness, the problems of not having contact with their own children, welfare dependency, the breakdown of the family, horrible treatment in the criminal justice system, but we know that affects men in general. It is not only a black issue. The decline in their job status, their real wages, decline in skills acquisition. Black men are doing far worse in all indicators than black women. For instance, the message they get from their women, from their community, is that they're not needed in the home, that they have no role as providers, as fathers, as anchors of the family, all that kind of thing. And so, it isn't, of course, surprising that we have levels of rage and angst and despair and hopelessness that are off the charts. But is this a race issue? Well, I'm sure there's a racial component. I'm not an expert in that area, but this is a men's issue. And the fact that everybody comes out and says it's a problem of white supremacism, and that in fact it's white men who are mainly to blame, tells us a lot about the way our discourse has developed over the last 40 years. And there's something to be said about feminism and how it came to hate white men in particular and blame them for everything, and to create situations in which black men are told that white men are their enemies, even as many of these violent groups, these Antifa and Black Lives Matter groups, are actually headed up by women who are telling men to go out and carry out this violence and this lawlessness. So, there's just so many interesting layers to talk about here. And to me, it's too bad that the only way we ever get to talk about men's issues at all is if we frame it incorrectly as solely a race issue. When we know, looking at the research of somebody like Sonia Starr, that the sex disparity in criminal injustice, the fact that men are far more likely to be killed by police, to be charged with crimes, to be convicted, to be given longer sentences, to not be allowed to make a plea deal, all those kinds of things. We know that this is a men's issue. the differences between white and black, when you look at all those figures having to do with crime and being charged and coming into contact with police in a negative way, the difference between white and black is tiny compared to the difference between men and women. So, there's so many different things. I don't even know where to start with all of this.
It's you started really well. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think you did.
Such a great point. That the whole system is set up to demonize white men and to make black men bad too. I mean, the whole system built to turn men into self-hating folks. I mean, you're the problem. And what do you expect if you do that?
And that's what we saw from the media. There is, like both of you have already said, there's a multitude of different angles on all of this happening, the riots, the police brutality, the perception of race in America. There's so many different ways of looking at this. And for those who don't know, by the way, Tom mentioned Candace Owen critiquing the black community. Candace Owen is black, so if you got an issue with that, take it up with her. He was simply repeating what she had to say. But I noticed two things. One is the media, and there seems to be a rather formulaic response to this, depending on which media outlet you're looking at. But they're parallel in one way. Everybody, whether you're watching Fox News or whether you're watching MSNBC, CNN, or anything else in between, the first thing that the news pundits are doing is expressing shock and outrage at the video. I can't imagine anybody looking at that video and not being outraged by it. I mean, that is plain to see, at least in my opinion. That's what I got, was police brutality 101.
Yes.
And sure enough, the guy ended up dead. There's no arguing against that. But then the left-wing media takes it to egging on these violent protesters in the street. And even on the right side, on Fox News, and what you saw out of people like Mike Pence coming out and not mentioning anything about the riots, but talking about racism, his first reaction. Nikki Haley did the same thing, came out and basically admonished us all to be mindful of our white privilege in the midst of this. And this is how powerful this narrative has become. Right. It's absolute bullshit, just like the numbers have always panned out, that if you're an unarmed white man, you've got a higher risk of getting killed by police than if you're black. And the color of the police officer has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on their propensity toward violence. But there's another aspect of this that I want to look at that I don't think you'll ever hear discussed on any news program. We have the job of policing criminals in the United States, in many large cities. Can you imagine the capacity for violence that it requires to be a police officer in a large city, chasing murderous thugs down alleys, going after people 2-3 times your size and your strength and much more aggressive than you are? We have to have a police force that is conditioned to operate violently, or they can't do their job. And we laud this in them. And when these guys make collars and take down big guys and throw them in prison or rough them up a little bit, the cops patting each other on the back, because that's what the job requires. And then when one of them crosses the line, we go into a absolute fit of virtue signaling about how on earth could this ever happen? Well, that's maybe a guy, as wrong as he was, that you would want there if you were in trouble. And we never talk about this fact that we demand a capacity for violence out of our police forces in order to protect innocent people. We insist on it. And if police acted according to the whims of race baiters like Al Sharpton, you would get what you've seen in cities with weak leadership and no police action. You have burned down businesses. You have business owners, people on the street assaulted and mugged and beaten viciously as police stand by. When police don't act with those characteristics, it leads to chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the consequence that what I'm asserting here is that part of what is built in to a society that requires a violent capacity in police force is you're going to have excessive force sometimes. I don't think, and I'll be the first to say it and people will scream at me, that's fine. I don't think what happened there was about race. I think it was about power. There could be, as Tom pointed out, a much bigger story behind this because there is a connection between the victim and the cop here. There was criminal activity involved. This guy was no Boy Scout. That didn't mean he deserved to die, of course. And of course, I'm compelled to say that because if I say he's no Boy Scout, oh my God, you're justifying what happened to him. No, I'm not.
Right.
I'm just saying this is a complicated story. These are complicated issues. And we're not going to address them in any way. You will never find a solution to this problem. You're never going to have enough police training to make you've got 35,000 police officers in New York City. Do you really think that we can sensitivity train them into all 35,000 of them never crossing the line physically?
Yeah.
It's an absolute insane objective. And we're going in the wrong direction with this. We have a criminal justice system. Lock those sons of bitches up, try them for the murder they committed, throw them in jail, and forget about them. But all this gushing over systemic oppression that does not exist, in my absolute belief, is getting us nowhere. It's doing absolutely nothing.
Yes.
Except destroying communities.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that does seem to be the idea, and it always seems to be this kind of utopian theorizing that then begins to be discussed almost immediately, that you could have cities where I mean, I don't know what the police presence is going to be minimal. And we're going to encourage the police not to intervene. We're going to have police not deal with any crimes that are considered not as important as others, so that there's much less police involvement in various communities, and that's going to make things better. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I have read a little bit. I mean, Heather McDonald's written about this. I know she's a controversial figure, but she's written about it with
She's
pretty
brilliant.
hard data. And the evidence seems to suggest that when you encourage the police not to be involved in communities and take a hands-off approach, what happens is that criminals flourish and law-abiding citizens, people who want to get on with their lives and want to be able to have businesses and want to be able to know that they're not going to be shaken down by thugs and they're not going to have bullets spraying through the windows, and that their children are going to be able to play out on the street without their lives being in danger. Those are the people who suffer. And in fact, crime goes up. And so this notion that if we just sensitize the police or train them in a different kind of way, or make them terrified of making a wrong move and then having their lives ruined through cries of racism, that this is going to somehow make everything better and communities are going to be therefore good for Black people and other minority communities in particular, just doesn't seem that it has any basis in reality whatsoever. And so, yeah, there is the level of denial that is involved. And as you say, Paul, all the virtue signaling that immediately starts up when there's an incident like this. And I find it dispiriting in that it just seems like from the highest levels right on down to the mass of people who are listening to the news and thinking that it's all quite simple, we are not able to have any kind of honest conversations at all. We just talk about racism
Right.
and police brutality, and that's it, as if these are simple issues with simple answers. And it does bother me too that when you look into the matter, even in a cursory way, in the way that I have, we know that there are white men, and again, it's mostly men, although there have been sometimes, I think there was a Minneapolis woman who was killed by a police officer.
Mohammed Noor was the police officer that
Yes.
shot her. And if we lived in a racist culture, where was all the protests on the streets from all the white racists about this Australian woman getting shot 8 times by a Minneapolis police officer who happened to be black?
Yeah, so there are things like that, and there were not the riots, and there are cases of white men, of course, more egregious than the George Floyd case. I think there's been talk lately about a guy named Tony Timpa. I read about him a little bit. Seemed quite a bad case of a violent killing of an unarmed man, white man, and that was not reported in the way this has been reported, and most people wouldn't even know about it. My mother is my gauge for a lot of this stuff. She grew up in an era when you could trust the news, at least more than you can now. So she listens to the mainstream television news, and then she tells me what she's being told to feel and think as a result. And when I said to her, well, it is very regrettable, but it's not as clear cut as it seems. And there are white men who are killed by police, and we don't hear about them. And there are no riots, and there is no outpouring of anger in the community at large. And she didn't believe me.
Right.
She did absolutely. She thought that was crazy talk.
Yep.
And because why would the media lie? And so she accepts these narratives, and I find it really disturbing that you can't fool all of the people all the time, but you can fool a lot of people a lot of the time, and the consequences for honest conversations about these really difficult issues are devastating. Actually, it's very, very worrisome. And when I see, mass kneel-ins where we have leaders like the mayor of Olympia, Washington, taking a knee in solidarity, and even I've seen pictures, I didn't verify them, some military people kneeling in solidarity, maybe even police officers, in a way identifying against themselves. Tweeting out their solidarity with lawless protests that have themselves resulted in death and the destruction of people's businesses and livelihood, and that the kind of the obeisance that is being demanded from figures in authority, which they are willing to give to movements that are lawless and criminal and horrifically violent, like Antifa, like some of the elements of Black Lives Matter. I find that really scary too.
Yes.
Especially when it's coupled with the assaults that we're seeing on the Second Amendment in the United States. There was, fortunately, and I do say fortunately, a couple of cases where looters went into the wrong business and went crashing into the wrong business and left on their backs. Because of store owners that had guns and were willing to protect their property. If the police are not going to prevent this from happening, it's incumbent on every individual to arm themselves and to protect life and limb, because the police aren't doing it. And I think if more people had done that, we would have seen these riots quiet down a lot quicker.
Yes. Because
there is only one way to meet irrational violence, and it's with more violence.
Yep. Yeah. And if you let one thing go, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And it's just...
We've been watching it happen.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's not going to bring this poor guy back.
Nope.
But the problem is we can't, as we've sort of talked around this, it's nearly impossible to have an honest discussion about who was George Floyd. He had an extensive criminal record. What was he doing that led to his arrest? Not to his death, but to his arrest. What's going on with all these questions that we're now not allowed to ask? Because now he's being lionized as some sort of savior.
Right.
I know my poor partner's brother died just a couple of months ago. We couldn't go to the funeral because of COVID. And today there's a memorial service broadcast on television with a packed house in there for this guy when other people in this country can't even bury their loved ones.
Yeah.
Um,
I know that the special exemptions that are being made for lawless behavior or simply for in the case of peaceful protest, the sort of celebration of what just up until a couple weeks ago would have been widely denounced as completely unacceptable. I mean, I think there are many churches that are still not open in the United States because you're not supposed to have more than 50 people. Oh, sorry. Gotta turn off my phone. You're not supposed to have more than 50 people gathering together. And up until like 10 days ago, anyone who did gather, even in the safest possible manner, was told that this was intolerable, that they were reckless, that they didn't care about their own safety or the safety of others. And suddenly now we have these mass protests, and that's okay.
and the same politicians that were having people arrested for church services that were being broadcast on radio as the congregation sat in their
cars
with their windows rolled up, those were intervened on by police. But when they're burning down businesses and beating people on the street, oh, that's a healthy expression. And you've seen the tweets out of the mainstream media of people talking about this is a healthy expression and progress.
Mm-hmm.
And this, well, what can I say?
It's not.
We live in very, very crazy times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very,
I'll go along
very,
with that.
very worrisome. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
And I'm not just talking about the murder of an innocent by police. I'm talking about all the insanity that's ensued since then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
The other
I mean,
thing that's
there's
come out since then is that guy was positive for COVID, which may have also played into his treatment by the police if they knew that. So who knows? There's all kinds of things we just don't know about this. You know, the media is telling us one little slice, and we don't get the whole story.
Yes, they're telling us George Floyd was a black saint.
Yes.
And that the 4 police officers who were involved in his arrest were all evil, white, well, one Asian patriarchs. And of course, I did a little research too. There was some ambiguity on for me, on the race of one of the police officers. His name is Kung, Keung. And it's a name of Chinese descent, but he appeared to have some African American features. And I was just curious about whether he was African American. So I started doing research. And you know what I found? All kinds of people getting blasted for even asking.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, I found 2 or 3 forums of people like, why are you asking?
Interesting.
What is it? As though they were afraid he was African American.
Right.
And didn't want to hear that for an answer.
Yeah.
But again, we're trying to have an honest discussion here about all of this. And it's not just the media making it crazy. There's a lot of very young, very stupid people out there right now.
And people who've been duped. I mean, the media has duped so many people, intelligent people, you know. And a part of the dupe is what we've been studying for how many years, you know, the whole thing about men, and men are terrible people and blah, blah, blah. But now we're seeing that it's wider. I mean, the whole birth is much wider than I ever expected. I mean, it's just huge what they've done. And it's left us in a real mess.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I don't know. All I can say is keep your head down and your powder dry.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
about right.
the question of what it is in American and in other societies, because certainly in Canada, this has stirred a lot of feelings, anger, virtue signaling, righteousness, desire to act out. What's going on that there are so many, mostly young men, willing to take to the streets, feeling that that this is the time, and what exactly, what have they been sold that they believe that this is the only option.
Yeah, see, I
It's
I think you articulated that very well in the very beginning, Janice. You
Yep.
know, it convinced me anyway.
And
That
two words on that too: father absence.
Yeah.
yep, there you go, there you go.
Yeah.
And it's not important. We don't need fathers.
If we
Holy
had
mackerel.
fathers in this society that were involved, I mean, across the board in the lives of their children, Antifa would not exist.
That's probably right.
Yeah, that's it,
That's
and so, I mean, every once in a while I'll have somebody write me and say maybe there can be a discussion about men's issues like that one, fatherlessness, like the fact that men are not able to take their role in families. They are being denied that role, whether as sons of fathers, which they desperately need, or whether as fathers of children, whether as providers for their family, the breadwinners, the earners, the producers, all the things that men want. They are being denied that. And if an honest discussion about that could come out of these riots and all of this mayhem, that might be a good thing. I mean, it's just so dispiriting to see it being that the possibility of honest conversation about the sources of all of this grief and rage, because there are some very touching moments captured, that I've seen on Twitter of men, black men, younger men talking to older men, sometimes younger black men talking to police officers, having these moments. And obviously there is some hunger there for
yes.
for direction, for intergenerational interaction of a positive sort, where older men lead younger men and give them advice about how to conduct themselves, or a better way forward than anger and violence and destruction. It's sad that that those conversations in general don't even happen. And of course, white men, especially poor white men, are in the exact same situation. There is no division there between white men and black men when it comes to all of these issues, and yet black men are being told over and over again, often by leftist feminists, that white men are the problem. White men are their enemies. They're the ones that have to be defeated.
Yep.
And that's not going to make anything better. It's not going to make things better for black men if white men are even further demonized and hated. And I mean, and the notion that we live in a white supremacist culture, when there are so many affirmative action programs, so much good-hearted effort on the part of government and communities, in academia, in all sorts of spheres, in policing, everywhere, to provide opportunities for black men. Doesn't really look like much of a white supremacist system, not a very effective one.
No.
That there is this kind of immediate outpouring of support, and that there is day-to-day attempts to change the situation of many black men. So there are really deep problems here for both black and white men that need to be talked about, and that's consistently denied and derailed in totally unhelpful ways. I mean, here in Canada, we have similar kinds of just crazy. I mean, we had a couple of years ago, there was a big government inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And a lot of men's issues advocates said, well, let's expand the inquiry, because Indigenous men are far more likely than Indigenous women to be murdered or to go missing, or, just generally to have their lives go completely off the rails. So let's expand the inquiry to Indigenous men, look at their situation. And I said at the time, why? Like, why restrict it to indigenous men? Why is that the only time we could even have a discussion about poverty, substance abuse, addiction, despair, people, suicide, all of that kind of thing? This is a situation that's faced by all men, and we can identify the reasons why. It's not that hard to figure out why. And yes, poor white men face these, men of all races face these problems. But we absolutely, if it comes to white men or any men that are considered to be part of the oppressor group, we can never acknowledge these problems.
We're forbidden to talk about them as having needs.
Yes, having any needs at all. So it's like this amazing thing that our society, and a lot of it is feminist culture, but it's not just feminism, but certainly it's got a huge role to play. This amazing thing that it has done to men. It has demonized, particularly white men, although all men, of course, are demonized. But then it says to non-white men, especially Black and Indigenous men, we will give you a kind of pass if you join with us in hating on our common enemy, which are white men. It doesn't make things any better for those minority men. And in fact, they are used by feminists.
Yeah, it's proxy violence.
Yeah,
they are used by them. You see in general. I mean, they're just using someone else to fight someone else. Let's you and him fight.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't really care about the conditions of their lives. I mean, even when you see like UN programs in Africa, the animus against African men is tremendous. The emphasis on helping African women and girls, nothing for African men and boys, for example. It just shows the sexism of all these programs supposed to be doing good. But this is it's an amazing trick, a sleight of hand that our culture has managed to pull to pit men against one another so that they're not even able to talk about their common problems and tackle them together.
Yes.
And I view this sort of like, if I look at this whole play like a psychodrama, what it appears to me, and this may seem a little far-fetched, so bear with me, but it does seem to me that since we've disenfranchised men, and fathers in particular, it's left a vast hole in the young people of our culture. And they're projecting their rage for that onto the patriarchal white male. And what they're trying to do is find a father in government to come in and control everything, because they've given up on the fathers that have been removed from their lives. And this seems patently obvious to me that this is what is going on, that this is a couple of fatherless generations of young men who have totally given up on real fathers and are looking for a surrogate in the government to come in and bring a form of order.
And the more chaos, the more that happens.
And exactly, the more chaos that they create, the more that happens, and the more fascism we see as a result.
Correct.
It's exactly what happened in Berlin in 1936.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course that's exactly what these organizations, I would see them more as communist, but when you get into fascism, I mean the role of the state is actually kind of similar in all those cases. That's what they want. They want greater and greater levels of disorder and chaos. They want the destruction of the family so that people come to rely more and more on the state. And that state will be both a stern father and, of course, a kind of hyper controlling mother. And women will be intimately involved in making the decisions about how the state deals with its citizens. And men don't do well under those kinds of repressive, I mean, nobody does well, obviously,
Right.
but when you
Right.
destroy the family, as we have been doing for so many generations, it's perfect for these kinds of totalitarian state bodies to step in and
After
to
all,
take
how much
over.
difference was there from Mussolini to Stalin?
Mhm.
Arguably at different ends of a spectrum, more like meeting each other in a
Yeah,
circle.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't. So what's our takeaway? What do we hope comes out of this in a best case scenario? I don't know. I mean,
My feeling is that nothing good is going to come out of this. We can't
Correct.
have an honest discussion about race in America. We cannot have an honest discussion even about police brutality. We can't be real about any of this. It's going to continue. The race whores like Al Sharpton will come out. They'll make some more money. They'll foment more division. They'll foment more separation.
Yes.
We've even got General Mattis out there accusing the president of fomenting division, and he has not done that in my vision at all.
Of
But
course not.
the world, the world of victim politics needs a scapegoat, and right
Yep.
now it's Donald Trump.
Yep.
And
They're
so
doing
even
everything
like
they
I said,
can to have him not get elected.
all these people, even on the right, are now going to converge on, and they're already doing it. So, is anything good going to come out of this? No. Will there be any fewer Black victims of police brutality? No, there won't. There won't be any
Right.
fewer white victims either, because we're not even talking about the problem, folks.
Just more chaos. And, like
Yep.
Scott Peck said years ago, that you can see where evil is by looking at its wake, and in its wake is always chaos. So what we're seeing is evil. That's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
What a terrible place to stop.
Yeah.
Well, we end discussions in sad places frequently, and this one is particularly sad.
It really is sad because it's not going to do any good at all, and there's no way out. And it's just, they've really created chaos in a way that can't be countered.
And it ignores the millions of Blacks who have moved finally to the middle class in the
Really.
past few decades, and the definite progress that we're making. If we could only get teachers' unions out of the way of educating young Black people and get them into decent schools. But guess the Black community won't allow that.
Yeah.
I don't see it coming to an end.
It's a mess.
It
Speaking of messes, folks
tragic.
on Facebook who may have been watching this, my apologies. We have not been able to see the comments at all. So it's a technological glitch that's completely my responsibility, and Paul will laugh about that. But
No, it's so serious that I won't even laugh about it. It's all Tom's fault.
It's always his fault. Anyway, so my apologies for not getting back to your comments. If there are any, I can't even tell how many people are watching. So maybe the next time after I practice a little bit more, we'll
Yeah,
do
we're
this a little
working
better.
this out. We got
We're working
glitches to
out.
work out. We'll get there.
And Regarding Men is coming, so hang in there.
Yes, more to come on that. And one other thing, just one other item before we close.
What's that?
Men
Are
Good.
success.
stumbling over success.
We end on a good note.
Yeah,
Are we finished?
Yeah.
Yes.
Stay safe, everybody.
All right. Yeah.
Stay
Stay
safe.
safe.
Protect yourselves.
Yes, indeed. We'll see you then. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Take care.